We will be talking to you guys all today about biodiversity. And I know we're here for Climate Week, but we hope to convince you, first of all, that biodiversity is highly relevant for all the conversations that we're having this week. And also provide you with some deeper insight into the tools, technologies, and data that can help support integration of biodiversity and climate decision making. So, this is gonna work. Perfect. My name is Claire Hoffman. I'm the head of partnerships for the Yale Center for Biodiversity and Global Change. And I'm joined up here today with Dr. Walter Yetz, who's the PI, the head of our center, and Chrissy Durkin, who is the chief commercial officer of Map of Life, which you will hear a little bit more about here soon. So like I said, we're going to start off by telling you why you should care about biodiversity this week. And we're going to tell you a little bit more about who we are, what we do at our center and at Map of Life, and why you should particularly listen to us and people like us when it comes to the integration of biodiversity and climate considerations. We'll talk you through our data, our tools, the applications of these in various places with various partners. And then we'll finish out hopefully with some Q&A. So we'll have some questions, hopefully you'll have some questions for us, but we also have some questions for you. So we're gonna throw these up here at the beginning, and we would love for you to mull on these, think over it while we're up here talking at you. We'd like you to think about what some of the use cases you might see for the data and the tools that we're gonna talk about today in your own work or work with your partners. And what features or tools or data, again, do we talk about that you think are most relevant? Or is there anything that we've missed that you think would be relevant that we don't talk about today? So we'll come back to these at the end. Put them in your brain. All right, if you're anything like me and not a native New Yorker, you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of concrete and steel around you this week. So we're gonna start with a little minute of nature, bring you back down into what it is that we're talking about this week at Climate Week. The environments, the species, the trees, the beautiful places around the world that we really care about. Not to say that New York isn't beautiful, but we'll take you back to the Amazon here for a second. And you've probably been hearing a lot this week about carbon and the importance of these locations, of these species, of these plants and trees for carbon sequestration, for climate change. But I would also like to remind you that those exact same places are equally important for species, for the animals, the insects, the plants themselves, some of the really charismatic ones that I have so artistically put up onto this slide, as well as many of the other ones that we don't really even think about, right? A lot of these places are home to hundreds, if not thousands, of different species that are important in and of themselves, but also as a cohesive system. And I want to remind you quickly that if I were to take you back a couple slides here, you would probably have a really hard time pointing out to me which aspects of this picture here are important for climate and which ones are important for biodiversity, right? You can't just point at one bit and say, well, that tree is important for climate because of carbon sequestration, when that exact same tree is important for providing habitats for key insect or animal species. And it's also important in and of itself as a species itself, right? So I could stand up here and rant for a very long time about the folly that was separating out the climate and biodiversity conversations back when. But the good news is that I won't do that because they're coming back together. We are increasingly seeing standards, metrics, approaches that are not only recommending, but actually mandating reintegration of biodiversity and climate considerations. Now, because these have been separate for a while, we don't necessarily have a lot of tools and data that bring the two together in a way that's really efficient and really direct for use by corporations or countries, governments, partners, whoever you're working with. They might see these as two very different things that are hard to bring together. So what we're going to talk about today is a lot of the data that we produce, its relevance for that species aspect of this picture. If I can get it to come back up. But also how we and tools like ours can help to bring both sides of that coin back together to make decision-making, reporting, impact tracking more efficient and more effective by putting these two arbitrarily separated conversations back into the same place. So I'm going to hand off here to Dr. Walter Yetz to talk about the science behind a lot of what we do in our center. And then we'll talk about the tools, and I'll hand over to Chrissy at the end to talk more about the tool development side of things and how the data gets integrated.
Super, thank you, Christian. I'd like to thank the organizers, Planetary Solutions at Yale, to include biodiversity in their program. as you heard from Claire, biodiversity is very much part of the solution, right? So when we talk about carbon sequestration through forests, that is biodiversity that we are talking about, right? And we can't just think of these things as something that delivers something for us in a very abstract way somewhere that goes then, that deals with the atmosphere, but it's very much something where you have people living and you have biodiversity, you have species living, right? And some places are much more valuable for biodiversity as part of a carbon crediting or whatever scheme it might be than others. And right now, what's missing in that whole equation and all of these approaches is very much the measurement, the appreciation for those really drastic differences. We're talking about many, many orders of magnitude difference that might exist in the quality of an overall forest might have that gets used for or considered for carbon sequestration, crediting, or whatever, because they are differing so much in biodiversity. So let me talk a little bit about the center. So we are a group of researchers, software developers, data scientists, AI experts increasingly, remote sensing experts, biologists, of course, ecologists, dedicated to delivering the best possible science, but then also more than that, products, information products that help us understand these drastic differences in biodiversity significance that we see within and among forests and across ecosystems at large. What we do is work a lot with raw data that's very heterogeneous. That might be the citizen science record that gets checked in for a phone app. It could be an old museum record. It could be new sensor data that's coming in from camera traps or acoustic sensors. And it could be something like eDNA. We combine that with remote sensing data from satellites, from UAVs. We'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. And we do what's called a model-based integration, so that we arrive at something that I'll talk about more in just a moment, a species-by-species understanding of what that data tells us about the distribution of a species and its change. And we do that over tens of thousands of species. And doing that ultimately allows us to support metrics, indicators, that we then, where we don't just stop there. So we don't stop at writing papers. We write a lot of papers, a lot of publications, but we also take the additional step of doing these products and developing them together with partners so that they're really usable. And then we work with other partners or some of the same partners to build tools around them so that they can really make it effectively all the way over into the decision-making arenas. We integrate a whole suite of different arrays of data, from trait data, remote sensing data, spatial occurrence data. We work with a vast group of partners around the world, a partnership that we've built over the last 15 years that is, in a way, a network of partners that extends across the globe and goes everywhere from research to local communities that are engaged in some of the data collection. That allows us to then do some of this data science magic to harmonize and clean data and bring it together, and this is what we call this central information or data. It's in this case a data cube, where for every species or ecosystem we have the data that's available for it in space and time that we can then dip into for various use cases. We bring that together in an infrastructure or a dashboard that's called Map of Life, where you can then look at single species, you can look at regions, understand better the species within them, or you can look at global patterns altogether. Let me step back for a moment here. It's Climate Week, and we've heard a lot about all the problematic issues that come about through climate change, right? Effects on people, also effects on ecosystem, effects on species. There is a lot of extinctions that are already happening, will happen thanks to climate change, and some of our work can help figure that out. Where are the places where we might want to help manage, adapt, what we need to prioritize for attention? But more than climate change, actually, over the next 20, 30 years, it's going to be land use change. It's agricultural expansion, urban expansion, other changes to the land cover that are absolutely justified and important in many cases, right? As part of the Sustainable Development Goals, there's all sorts of development goals around people that are part of it, right? That necessarily require some changes to the landscapes. Right now, we're doing this in very much a blind way as far as biodiversity is concerned. What we're trying to support with our project is a democratization of access to information that can then, in a non-prescriptive way, injected by stakeholders locally, regionally, nationally, in their decision making so that they can plan with taking biodiversity into account. How much they will depend, right? But right now, everybody is going about ignorantly, and we're ignorantly losing biodiversity unnecessarily because we are lacking that information. There's a lot of great commitments, the global biodiversity framework, within the climate convention, there are commitments around biodiversity, there's companies, organizations around the world, countries that are champions around biodiversity. They want to set up more parks, work with local communities, indigenous communities to support conservation. But what's missing in all of this often is that information, and accessible information most of all, right? That allows them to do this smartly. So it's not just about, well, we increased the protected area network by 10%. Okay, so what does that mean, right? It really depends on which 10%. Because only if you know what these 10% deliver for biodiversity, and also for people, right? Because biodiversity is important for people, delivers a lot of important benefits. Then do we actually know how much we are advancing in the larger goals. So that's really at the core of what the center's research is about and what Map of Life as the flagship initiative of our center at Yale is all about. Supporting, bringing the best possible science, best possible information into the hands of stakeholders from local communities all the way to national or international decision makers. What we do is, species by species, for tens and hundreds of thousands of species, integrate all the data that's accessible to us, publicly available or available through our partner network, and then we build models of the expected distribution of a particular species. So here you look at a really beautiful hornbill that I worked with a lot in the field. We had actually a PhD project working on that species with radio telemetry in a particular cornea in Kenya. But also we were able to look at the larger context here. So we are looking at the Horn of Africa that's experienced a lot of land use change. Obviously climate change is already impacting. It's getting drier, extreme droughts happening there due to climate change. But also we see immense land use change driven actually by the Middle East for food. So that it's this double whammy of climate change and land use change already happening. And knowing what's where here is really, really critical if you want to succeed in safeguarding species for future generations. So here, our attempt to bring together all the available information for that species in one place. There's no other service, no other infrastructure, no other project in the world that's doing that in this way. You can actually click your way all the way through to that one record that you might have checked in some citizen science app 5 years ago. That you could access that directly. So there's full attribution there, full recognition of who is collecting that data and a recognition of the ownership of that data as well. But we can then feed that information into models that allow us to go, and in this case, a very threatened species in West Africa, beautiful small forest antelope, from very sparse records and some additional information that we have thanks to remote sensing and science, that research has been conducted on that species and its habitat preferences, and arrive at a modeled map that looks like this. This is a forest-dependent species, sort of low to mid elevations, and this is the only remaining habitat that it is left. In fact, blue is the only remaining habitat it has at this point. Red is the habitat that it lost just during the last 20 years. So what this allows us to do is appreciate how much that species has been declining in population thanks to this loss and fragmentation of habitat, but also pinpoint very much where that happened, right? And in the context, this feeds into an indicator that's been adopted in the global biodiversity framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Species Habitat Index. We can actually divvy it up country by country. Who are sort of the main actors that have kind of contributed, unfortunately, to this loss, right? But equally, we can look at conservation actions that are happening. Which are the countries and places where there is reserves that have been put in place that then help safeguard that species. That's another global indicator. And we're able to aggregate that up to the globe, and that gets used in the global tracking in our progress towards the 2030 biodiversity goals as a formally adopted indicator. But you can bring it down to the level of a single species and the particular square kilometer pixels and the actions that are happening there, safeguarding or loss. So that's really the power of what bringing science together with this infrastructure allows us to do. We're able to then make forecasts as well under climate change or under future land use change scenarios. Where might there be losses in the future that then this information can then be used by NGOs or governments in the region to preempt potential losses or think about their spatial planning with this in mind. So I mentioned two of these indicators, the Species Protection Index and the Species Habitat Index, that have now been adopted by a range of actors, including the convention, and that get increasingly used now by governments, but also by increasingly businesses and others to track how they're doing in supporting the overall goals of the convention. And with that, maybe I hand over to
Sure. Yep, I will jump back in here. So what I want to talk about as well on this topic of indicators is the idea that we can start with that individual species level data where we know where a species is expected to exist, how that habitat might have been lost or gained over time, how can we project it into the future under different land use scenarios. And we can also then take it and aggregate it up for all the different species that are expected to exist in a particular area to provide metrics that are of particular use for pretty much any partner who is working above the species level, right? So that might be companies, that might be government ministries, it might be NGOs, all of these groups that work at spatial scales and need to know what's happening for all of the species, all of the things of concern within a given area. So that's where these indicators come in part. Thank you. So like Walter said, we have these 3 indicators that are adopted under the Global Biodiversity Framework, and they assess a range of habitat and conservation considerations for each of these species. Each species gets an individual score, and then we aggregate them up for areas of interest like countries. We also are developing indicators that integrate other considerations that are in alignment with emerging standards and metrics, which I think Chrissy will talk about a little bit more here in a second. We also have other forms of aggregate data that we use for our partners and applications in different areas. So these might be species distribution models showing richness or rarity in for species in different areas. So how many species would you expect to be in any given pixel on that map? Or how geographically limited are the aggregation of all of the species that exist in that particular pixel? So beyond just an individual species, how is it doing? How is that location doing in terms of all of the species that we might expect to see there? So we have some of these metrics that are available on Map of Life, some on some of our partner platforms, like these are from the Half Earth Project map. And then we also work to allow our partners to dig into other areas of interest, right? So they can get on our maps and they can look at patterns as a whole at the continental scale or the regional scale, and we can also bring it in finer again for them. So on Map of Life, any of you could go on to mol.org at this very moment, and you could look at any region of interest. So you could upload a shapefile if you have one. You can look at countries or administrative units, states, provinces, and you can also draw directly on the map and end up with a spot that looks just like that. And we will provide for you automatically a list of all of the species that we expect to be in that particular area, along with their conservation status, the scores for the various indicators that we calculate. We can filter it by the type of record that we have for them, the taxonomic group. We can play with this data in a lot of different ways to provide instantaneous information for our partners. We also work one-on-one with a lot of other partners to package this data up in ways that is relevant to their use cases. So we work with partners to integrate different types of data like irrecoverable carbon or human pressures. We can create optimization models for partners based off of things other than species that they have to consider, right? We are very aware of the fact that while we might think species are incredibly important, the rest of the world sees that importance in parallel with development needs and infrastructure and carbon sequestration and all of these other things that we're balancing at the same time as species conservation. So we can bring a lot of that information into one place for these partners. We also produce one-off individual reports for partners to help them communicate with potential donors or to message to the general public about the importance of the work that they're doing. And we also, on an annual basis, publish a report called the Species Protection Report on one of our indicators. As a quick plug here, the next version is coming out on October 29th. So if you're interested in seeing how trends in this indicator have changed over the last year, check back in on Map of Life in about a month, or come up to me afterwards and I can make sure to get a copy to you when it comes out. We also build platforms for our partners to show this data and any of the bespoke calculations that we're doing for them. So this is an example from our partners at Nature and Culture International, where we built an Esri dashboard for them that took the Species Protection Index and added in calculations for the areas of protection that they work in specifically. So they don't work in just the formal national parks in countries in South America. They also work in what they call subnational protected areas, so community conservation areas, locations where we know a lot of amazing work is being done that is not necessarily captured in our global map of formal protected areas. But what we were able to do for them is integrate the areas of those locations where they're working and help to capture the impact on species that their work is having, even if it's not officially recognized in some of these global indicators. So we created this dashboard for them, did this bespoke calculation. They can now use this tool to, again, communicate with potential funders, with partners to really show the impact of the work that they're doing in a tangible way that integrates our standardized data from across the world. The final thing I'm going to talk about here before I hand back over to Walter is a tool that we've created, co-developed with government partners around the world. So we know that governments have very particular needs when it comes to conservation decision making. Again, they're looking at the importance of species in different areas, but they have a lot of other things to think about as well. So this tool allows them to upload their own data for us to integrate things like development plans, areas of conservation or expansion of road network interest, things like that. We can show changes in our indicators over time. We can break it down by subnational administrative areas of interest, by species, by taxonomic group. We can provide a lot of this personalized packaging of our information so that they don't have to go and sift through giant database of information to figure out what's relevant to them. We know that they are working on tight deadlines and tight timelines, and this helps us provide that information for them right away. Again, I've gone through all these very quickly because I want to make sure we leave time for some of these other things. If you're interested in hearing more about this, definitely bring it up in the Q&A at the end or come find me and we can chat about all of these different tools. So now I promised that we would talk about more than just species today. A lot of that work is being spearheaded through innovations that we've recently had through the X Prize Rainforest competition and the work that Chrissy is leading with Map of Life Solutions. So I just want to let you know we haven't forgotten about that. This is important background information for you all to have, and then we're going to build on it from here. So Walter, I'll hand back to you here.
Sure. Thank you. And I just want to give a shout out to one other partner that we work with very closely. It's the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and some of the same data and the sort of metrics that you've seen here are feeding into the half-Earth project map. And some of you might have heard about the Half Earth, right? It's a book that Ed Wilson had written several years ago that inspired that 30 by 30 goal that was then adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So 30% of protected areas on land, freshwater, and sea. And our metrics have become a real central part of this quest, as I was saying earlier, right, to actually deliver not percent area, but biodiversity outcomes. So also a really great place to check out the Half-Earth Project map. You can just type it in to Google and you'll be taken there. But let me talk a little bit about then the very local scale. Actually, I started out running around first in the mountains in Europe, but then increasingly in Africa, counting birds, counting frogs, and trying to fill in the gaps of biodiversity knowledge, which were and still are huge. In central Congo Basin, I had a bird species in my hand, beautiful bird. Hadn't been described yet. It was undiscovered. Turns out half a year later, the American Museum of Natural History took an expedition not too far away from where I was, and they then actually properly described it. I was 19 years old at the time. I knew this is a different species, but I wasn't ready to just kill it and bring it back, which would have been the requirement to actually get it formally described. So I started out running around forests, counting species, and just fascinated by this amazing tropical biodiversity, trying to get to grips with it. But after a while, I realized I can run around my whole lifetime, different forests, and I would make this little a dent, right, in the larger problem of gap of biodiversity knowledge. And I felt like, well, it's not maybe the best use of time. And then I scaled up more and more, and I became more of a modeler and a arrived at what we're talking about here. But it's now actually, thanks to some of these new technologies that we are together, and I personally am so excited to be able to come back again to that local scale. Because we are now able, thanks to GPS tracking, which I'm not talking about, the ability to put little tags now, satellite tags on species and individuals, follow them around. But also through other technologies, particularly camera trapping, other visual sensors that you deploy in the forest, through acoustic sensors, through UAVs that you can then bring and that allow you to project way into the forest. You're able to now collect evidence, digital vouchers, right, about the biodiversity in that place that are just immensely scaling up what you're able to do, what any individual, not just an expert, is able to do in a particular place. So, you know, our museum at Yale, Peabody Museum, there's a large collection of really important bird specimen, right? Those were from like expeditions bringing back individuals. And that's the specimen, but it's a very intensive way of doing stuff, right? Of assessing and collecting biodiversity data. So now we're talking about digital specimen, right? And they're as good almost. They're not as good, I should say. There's a really very important need for museum science still. But we're now, anybody can collect a digital specimen. And it can be shared, and it can be used by scientists without having to ship around some specimen, right? It can just be uploaded. Some of you might be familiar with some of these citizen science efforts, right? Here in the US, there's eBird, there's iNaturalist, and others. In other parts of the world, there are other efforts that engage anybody in the collection of data. And some of those folks get really into it, really strong specialist amateurs that can actually identify stuff. In other cases, it's like people happy to share what they see. And it can feed into our work. We can then use very smartly AI to sift through what are the interesting images, what can you already kind of automatically identify, and where do we need to bring in experts to do it well. And that's now vastly increasing the amount of information that we can bring to these maps that I just showed earlier, right? So a bunch of that hornbill, a bunch of those records were from citizen scientists, right? Images or people just checking in the recording. Here, this is, if you will, the next generation that's coming. And I'm not saying we should let loose drones everywhere, the last thing, right, that I want to advocate for. However, when you are in the, how many of you have been in a tropical rainforest? See, a lot of you. So you know what I'm talking about, right? It's not easy to move around there. So the traditional way of collecting stuff, there's like or if you go somewhere new, actually some of our collaborators, they usually get helicoptered in and then you whack a trail and you have to wait for a week for things to calm down, and then the expert can walk the trail and listen for that hour in the morning where you can hear stuff, right? Because then it calms down again. And if you wanted to go birding, you had to get up at like 5 in the morning, right? So, and it's sometimes really, really hard to get to these places. So here we are, X-Prize Rainforest, and actually we just 2 hours ago talked at an event organized at the World Biodiversity Summit that was all about these new technologies, co-hosted by X-Prize. Their challenge was you have 24 hours to survey a square kilometer of remote tropical rainforest and have 48 hours to analyze that. And your solution needs to not step foot inside that square kilometer, and it needs to be scalable. It needs to be something where with some more investment, some more efforts, in a few years, it's something you could actually just send in a box to a local community and they could use that to then survey intensely that particular patch of forest. So this is what we came up with, a whole range of drones that in an autonomous way we were able to send into the forest to take pictures that we then sifted through with AI to identify, like in some cases we picked up birds at random. So we had thousands and thousands of images, and there is that bird sitting on feeding on a fruit, right? You also get an understanding of a biological interaction that AI sifted out for us from that. We get these automated squares created by AI, and no, AI cannot yet identify this butterfly, but it really helped in prioritizing images for our experts that we link in through that remote dashboard to then identify quickly, right? And that's what allowed us to then, in the 48 hours that followed, identify a total of 250 species for that square kilometer forest, including a lot of threatened species. We had anteaters that hadn't seen that before. We had range extensions of hundreds and thousands of kilometers, species that hadn't been known for that region. All through that combination of UAVs that would take images, or even more excitingly, collect acoustic data through microphones that we flew through the forest in an autonomous way. And through eDNA that we also collected. with drones through swabbing. So we had about 40 species just identified for eDNA. So species poop on the vegetation. These are bat species, bird species, amphibians, that we were able to then match against the reference library and correctly identify to the species level. So this is really a game changer for the rapid and robust collection of biodiversity data. We then won that prize and had a bunch of really great celebrations, but what came out of it more is this field-proven technology now that needs some more years to really kind of make it cheap and easily accessible for everybody. The hope is that we would ultimately have a box that, you can ship for around, right? You can just send to somebody, they use it for a few weeks, and then it gets sent off again, and that's something for a few $100s or a few $1,000s a community can use to then really get the local evidence that they want. So it's really, really fascinating, new era, transformative in my view, for how we can get better evidence to support better biodiversity decisions in the tropics. So empower local actors, right, with the information that helps them make the right decision that they want to make. And at the same time, bring very detailed, high science grade information into these larger databases, right? And then do better global mapping that then allows us to better measure how we're doing in progressing to the shared goals. Yeah, with that, I'm going to hand over to Chrissy. Maybe just a word. I'll leave you to that last part here, right? So Map of Life started over 13 years ago with a paper, and we got recognized by Nature magazine right from the beginning as an important initiative. Then we had brought in more and more partners, increased now over the years the number of species that we're addressing and the number of areas where we're active. And then we had here then recently the X Prize. But then with support from Yale Ventures, actually very proactive, nudging us, we were able to open a new chapter that now Chrissy is going to talk about that's outside the center, but we're really excited about having enabled that success and that new impact arena that is otherwise just not accessible to an academic center. Over to you, Chrissy.
Hey everyone, it's really good to be here with you all. And yeah, it's always great to hear you guys talk about all of that because it still makes me excited. My focus is really on, okay, we have all of this science, all this data, we have the ability to collect more data. It's so important, and Claire touched on this a lot with the governments and the NGOs, but how do we actually use that to make decisions? Like, we're at a very critical point in time right now, right? So if we have this really remarkable science now, how are we actually able to structure that in a way that people can make different and better decisions for the future of our planet with, right? So we're super excited, and actually, background on myself, I've been working with tons of different types of folks on using data to make decisions in specific project sites for the past, since kind of throughout this timeline. That's what I've been working on separately from the center, and going and talking to restoration projects or to companies or to local communities and looking at, okay, within this specific area, how can we use data from the ground to make better decisions? But now we get to scale that up with all of the underlying science that's been developed through the Yale Center for Biodiversity. So in January of this year, we got to launch Map of Life Solutions, which is an initiative with a new team to take all of this underlying science that's been developed and package it into products and ways to interact with it so that different groups, and especially corporations, can make better decisions on top of it. So what we're working on now is essentially taking that core infrastructure, that ability to look across time and space at what's happening with it, with nature, with ecosystems, with species, and be able to query that in ways that make sense to different groups, and to build a whole new suite of products on top of that so that we can really get concrete on how and where we're taking nature action. And one of our biggest focuses right now is on corporates. Talk about folks who have a lot of impact globally and have a ton of opportunity to change the trajectory of how we're using land and oceans on this planet. And so what we're really looking at now is, and we're at a critical time too, right? For the past 20 years, corporates have been thinking about their emissions. They've been thinking about climate change. They've been thinking about how do they track that? How do they monitor that? How do they start to become a lot more efficient? right now everyone is waking up to the nature side of the coin, right? They're getting consumers who are pressuring them and saying, okay, but what is your nature impact? They're getting regulations, more so out of the EU than our side of the world, but we'll take it, that are saying you need to disclose this, or there's voluntary disclosures that corporates are starting to uptake. And then there's also quite material risks, right? They're starting to see within their raw materials that they're sourcing, oh, climate change and all of these land use changes are actually having significant impacts, and investors are saying, what are your nature risks of your company, and how are you actually measuring that and tracking that and optimizing around that and making better decisions? So we're at a point in time right now, in the very early days of these emerging pressures and opportunities for corporates at this massive scale to actually look at their nature impact and start thinking about, how am I going to do a better job around that? How am I going to make better decisions? And what can I invest into to really create resiliency within my own operations and supply chains? So that's what we're looking at now, which is quite exciting and fun. And part of that is also, as Claire mentioned, being able to marry that with those climate goals, because they are all quite interlinked, right? If you're taking action in a specific space, a lot of the time the benefits are both for climate and nature. And there's this fun chart here that is looking at regulations that I'll go through quite quickly. But on the left-hand side, you have the climate regulations through the Paris Agreement. Then on the right, you have the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then all of the emerging corporate frameworks for tracking nature and biodiversity. And they interlink quite well. And a lot of those metrics that Claire showed on that slide previously, we went to great lengths to kind of take all of that underlying data infrastructure that both Walter and Claire spoke about and map. And so like that scalable infrastructure, which is so exciting to me, it's something that we've been missing, that like it unlocks so much potential. We've taken that infrastructure, that ability to go all the way down into that data cube. If you remember that slide earlier on where you saw the little cube that had all the layers, we can take that and we can package it and align it with what folks are looking for reporting, and then how they can actually make decisions on top of that. So that mapping was quite important, because now corporates can use that scalable biodiversity data infrastructure for their regulations and reporting, but that also disaggregates down into a site level so that they can make decisions about where they can optimize where they're restoring or where they're sourcing, or be able to make quite concrete decisions. So that's kind of the goals of that scalability of metrics. How do we use the same data infrastructure frameworks in which you can go all the way and zoom out and say, these are all of my business activities that I'm touching globally, right? Sometimes like thousands of sites globally. Or maybe they just know the municipalities, right? Or maybe they just know the state data, whatever data they have. This is where we're touching. And we can look at that and we can help them prioritize where they need to act and dig in deeper. But then that also needs to be able to go all the way down into the farm, right? Into really specific granular sites where they can start to optimize like very specific actions, whether it's regenerative agriculture or whatever they're doing on the ground, right? And it needs to sit in that same framework. And that's more challenging than you would think. And that's what this science really facilitates, is that scalability of data and metrics. So, and then also to touch on that, as Walter shared with the X Prize developments, there's areas where we have a lot of data and there's areas where we don't have very much data. And being able to also use those metrics in that framework to say, we need to invest in more data collection here so that we can actually have reliable outputs from which we can make decisions is really important. And so through those scalable technologies, we can actually make recommendations on where and how people are collecting data to fill in those gaps much more efficiently, so that you can then zoom back out and have reliable information from which you're making these kind of zoomed out decisions, and then go back into that granularity. Just quickly, also have mapped those metrics and that structure against carbon credit, co-benefit frameworks, biodiversity crediting frameworks. So just really trying to make it easy to align across these different use cases, because we need to get pretty creative about how all of these activities are getting financed, and having the underlying standardized data structures is really helpful for doing that. So I'll try to go through this pretty quickly so we have time, but what we've been developing is the ability to actually interface and interact with these data and metrics in ways that make sense to companies and that they can use for actually prioritizing where and how they're acting. So I'll go through this quickly, and then we can, if anybody's interested and wants to kind of get the details, happy to talk about that later. But it starts out at this is a sourcing risk portfolio, right? So this is at a global scale. These are all of the regions in which this company is operating. This is a cosmetics company. And you can see your global biodiversity and nature impact aggregated here, and you can also see which sourcing regions you should be focusing on. So this is saying Para Brazil has the highest risk that we can then zoom into. So we're gonna zoom into that region, and then I can actually see all of the areas in which I'm sourcing. And because, as Walter mentioned, we have the ability to actually say, these are the most biodiversity critical areas that you should be looking at, we can help advise corporates on saying, okay, across all their sourcing areas, for these specific commodities, for these actions that they're taking, this is where they should really zoom in and pay attention first to where they're taking nature action or where they have the highest risk to that commodity, right? This is for palm oil that we're looking at right now. And that enables much more targeted action, seeing where their risk is most material and how they can really focus their efforts. So I'm gonna flip through this super quickly, but essentially we can do that across different commodities. So you can go in and you can see across all of the different commodities I'm sourcing, where should I be paying attention? It's a lot of this prioritization action that we can help facilitate. So this is by commodities, and then I can even zoom in to the actual species and biodiversity within these sourcing areas that I'm impacting, and I can go all the way down into the species level, and I can see where I have overlap with individual species. So different ways to sort of interact with this data. But one of the exciting things that we can do is also to go one step further than just kind of reporting or prioritizing and flag specific actions that you can take for specific risks that you're facing within nature. So this is looking at, this first one says oil palm habitat fragmentation endangers key species. And this is specifically talking about species of monkeys, spider monkeys, white-cheeked spider monkeys within Para, because there's fragmentation within their sourcing areas that this is flagging. And then you can actually go in and you can say, I'm gonna take an action around this and simulate, if I took this action within this sourcing area, what are my potential nature and biodiversity outcomes of doing that, right? So I'm gonna say simulate impact, and then I can actually create an action plan around that. So I'll go through this quickly, but I can check what is most important to me, what types of actions can we flag for people that they can do. For example, this is saying area restoration to create that connectivity back, right? So I'm gonna check that. I'm gonna say what's most important to me in terms of metrics and considerations. Then we can go in and we can actually make recommendations on where to restore and create connectivity back into the habitat to help reduce the risk to that spider monkey species, right? So this is saying these two pink areas are recommended restoration areas. I can select those and I can go all the way into finalizing, that's my plan. That's the action I'm gonna take in the specific sourcing area for nature and biodiversity. Then I can sort of see the results on my metrics in that area of if I were to take that action. So I can actually see how those critical sort of framework aligned metrics that we talked about earlier are gonna change if I were to restore that habitat for those species. And I'll keep going ahead pretty quickly here, but, and the last piece of this is if I want to actually understand concretely and make those claims about that action, how am I gonna monitor that? How am I gonna actually see if that worked and what the impacts were? And that's where we go back into the local data collection piece of that and being able to optimize around that. So I'm back into this specific area plan, and I can actually go in and I can see this is one of those restoration areas, right? So I'm quite zoomed in now. This is one restoration area that I'm looking at, and I can see up on the right-hand side that my species information index is low. Essentially what that's looking at is confidence. So it's saying there's an opportunity for higher resolution data, right? And then we can actually optimize our survey that we're going to collect around the best data to inform and report on that action that I just took. So I can say this is the best survey design and the data collection methodologies I should use in this area. And then I can go in and actually work with partners on the ground or with us to collect that data and funnel it back into the system. And then I can, once I've collected that data, visualize it, and then I can see how that data here is improving my confidence in those models that I'm using to make those decisions. Then all of that funnels back up into my global reporting, right? So as I'm improving data quality, I can actually see higher confidence across my whole sort of sourcing portfolio. So that's just an example of how we're sort of taking all of the work that the center has done and creating tools and products on top of it that people can use to really make concrete decisions in how they're acting across both large spatial scales, but also kind of zoomed in at the project level. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Claire.
Perfect. Yep. So looking at our time, as much as I would love to be very selfish and ask you to answer my questions first, I think we'll start with just general Q&A. So if anybody has questions for us, any of the very wide range of things we've covered today, we'd love to answer any questions, have deeper conversations. And if anybody would like to tell us about these, please feel free as well.
Hi, this is really great work. I was just wondering how do you also aggregate? Like, it seems like you have partnerships with local communities and local areas, and that's how you collect data, but do you also aggregate data from like the UN Biodiversity Lab or from the IUCN? Like, how does that work if you have like species at risk? And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In fact, it's more the other way around, right? So the UN Biodiversity Lab, we haven't finished it yet, but they've asked us to get a lot of our layers represented up there. So what they're showing there is aggregate layers of importance, etc. We tend to, these places that just like, well, here's a layer, here's another layer. There, we feel like, well, sure, you can do that, but it's much more helpful if you actually can then drill through all the way to what is actually the data behind that layer, right? That's why we prefer folks to then come straight to Map of Life and actually directly interact with the data and all the provenance and the effort that's behind these data, right? So UN Biodiversity Lab is an aggregator, and our layers will show up there. We are late in getting them to them. With IUCN, a lot of the IUCN red list assessments ultimately use that type of data that we're pulling together, right? Some of the maps are getting, some of the same maps get fed into these assessments. And so we're directly supporting that effort that way. We're also pulling the threat, the status from them, as you've seen, right? So because it's an important assessment. Unfortunately, it only happens every 6 to 10 years for a particular species group. So in the meantime, a lot is changing, as I was showing you, right? So that that species losing range annually, that forest antelope in West Africa, right? And then some of the dynamics in terms of protection also change annually. So that's really where we come in, complementing some of these larger, more sort of simpler but important threat assessments with something that's much more dynamic and driven by satellite data that's coming in all the time. So that's a little bit the complementarity there.
Hello. I'm actually going to take a crack at answering your two questions and then following up with a question of my own. So I work for a carbon project developer. A lot of our clients are asking about biodiversity and indicators and what they can do to track. I've been very excited. This is not my first exposure to Map of Life. I've been very excited about the work you all have been doing. I guess what we have found is that the 1 kilometer resolution is actually a bit too coarse for our projects to make, meaningful decisions. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. I would love to see that resolution come down, but I know I'm also a remote sensing geek, so I understand all of the things that go into that. Is there any effort at making a lower, I always get this messed up, smaller resolution map available? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, and you get my juices flowing here because all of my research is in a way about scale, right? And the scale of reliable evidence and the scale of, in this case, information need. And those are disconnected. However, we can cascade the uncertainty forward, right? So the finer the scale, the finer the grain, You know this species occurs in Central Park, but this water bird, if you know it's a water bird, well, it's going to occur in one of these water bodies, right? So we can very quickly downscale for that species group. For other species groups, they're like forest, right? We don't quite know yet, well, does it require oaks or not? And you're in a particular corner only, right? So we are, however, able to downscale to 30 meters with Landsat data, with Sentinel data. The uncertainty becomes a bit larger, right? But in many ways, you can just cascade that forward into your decision making. So it is possible, and that's something that, particularly in partnership with the team that's looking after these more dedicated applications, we can actually bring into the picture. And already, I should say, at the 1 kilometer, there is also still uncertainty, right? Important thing is, and that's what our science is all about, is to capture that and communicate it and cascade it forward. And we have the one main indicator in the Global Biodiversity Framework that is actually about biodiversity information, how much it's progressing, right? And because we're capturing that very, very piece about it. But yes, it's absolutely possible to downscale, and we are very much aware that that's a need in many places. But also I encourage you, go big, go for larger projects, man.
Trust.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I mean, so we can downscale, and then we can also see the confidence, right? And then we can say, this is the additional data you should collect at that scale. So like that whole process gets you to a pretty good place that we can now do. And so it'd be cool to look at some of your projects.
So what we can say is like, these are the 10 really important species that really add so much value to that carbon credit or whatever you have here. These 10 species, like, and for these 3, we are certain they're occurring in this corner of the square kilometer. These other ones, we recommend this type of rapid survey to just establish them.
So my apologies for coming in late, but so once upon a time I was in charge of the Forest Service, and we had an issue in the Pacific Northwest dealing with the northern spotted owl.
Of course.
And insiders tell me that it is likely this will become an issue again with the new administration, which has a zeal for harvesting more old growth timber than had been done in the past. And I'm thinking about the applicability and utility of this tool to identify nesting areas and areas of importance for the continued existence of the spotted owl and other species within an area. Am I thinking correctly that this could be of utility? I'm not saying the new administration will give a damn, but could be used as a mechanism to minimize the potential damage associated with the harvesting in the Pacific Northwest, which is likely to begin in earnest here in the next year or two. I'm Jim Lyons, by the way.
Wonderful, thanks for joining us, and that's an awesome question. Let me first say that there are some outstanding organizations that are active in that region and really focused in, homed in on the spotted owl issue.
And many of them sued me when I started, but
they're some of the best placed folks, right, to help figure this out, and actually they do some really good survey work there, etc. Right? So this is not about replacing that. What we're talking about here is, but let's talk old growth forests more generally. Let's talk about more than the spotted owl, but also let's happily talk about the spotted owl. So very quickly, that acoustic solution that we developed as part of the X Prize, it would work beautifully for nocturnal birds to, in a contiguous way, map the acoustic landscape and in a very detailed way, map also in some of the inaccessible pockets. Where are they active? What do they need different times of the year? So I think it's actually going to change up the way some of the spotted owl and other nocturnal or diurnal mapping can happen, and some of the detail in which some of these decisions can happen. So because a lot of this is about, we're not going to be able to avoid use of some of these landscapes, right? It's more about being smart about that use and figuring out, okay, which corners to avoid, what is the right dynamic of doing so, etc. So these UAV-based approaches can be extremely powerful for landscape level management at that scale, which is in some cases even finer than 30 meters resolution, right? So mapping the territories, etc., etc. So that's a very specific answer. Then more generally, this combination that we just pointed out, right, of model-based information telling you like what are the species that are expected to be there, and then as needed here and there adding survey data is an extremely cost-efficient way that can be very quickly deployed, and I was emphasizing tropical biodiversity, but equally like anywhere out west or anywhere even in the northeast, right, where you need a rapid and cheap way of assessing things that doesn't require a scientist to drive there, but could be executed by a local NGO or a local community member. So those are really outstanding. I think we are onto a new era now where we can leverage some of these global models locally and then complement them with additional data collection. There's also nothing like coming back with like, well, here's this awesome image, right, that we collected of that species of concern, or here's this fantastic recording, right? It's not like any recording, it comes from over here, this up on that mountain over there. That's where that owl lives, right? And you can really point the recording to the place. That's what these digital vouchers allow you. They're more than digital vouchers. They also give you, it's a voucher that's sitting on the map, at a particular place in time, a point in time. So I absolutely see new opportunities here to, deal with fewer resources that we might have for some of that work in the US, right? And get some of that into the hands, even outside the agencies maybe, right? Into the hands cheaply of folks on the ground that can help bring about some of the information that's needed here.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was very informative. So a bit of context, I worked with my professor, L. Frank, back in undergraduate. He did a lot of work on ecosystem services, ecological services valuation. I think one of his recent papers was looking at the vulture in India and kind of quantifying the economic impact in terms of outcomes that, I mean, we all care about biodiversity here, but I feel like sometimes when you have to link it to people who might not be part of the choir, like you have to talk about in terms of like jobs or health impacts. So just kind of curious if you could speak more about like the potential to use this tool for ecosystem services valuation. Is there appetite from the corporate partners or partners that you work with in terms of like using that data?
Tons of appetite for ecosystem services, and I'll let Walter touch on like what's possible there. But and then being able to actually quantify monetarily, right, the potential risk and impacts of continued action in certain ways is also of a lot of interest. So we're starting to talk to different groups who specialize in actually like economically quantifying these things and seeing how we can bring this data together with some of those assessments, which I think would be really helpful and interesting to people. But certainly, I mean, things like pollinators, right? Critically important to a lot of these folks, and those are things that we can help a lot with. So, and then we're also working on starting to integrate things like water layers directly alongside the biodiversity layers, carbon layers, and all those things so that we can start to bring all of those pieces together for decision making. But yes, lots of interest on that front. Agreed.
And I'll add that this is one of the top questions that we get asked by government partners, particularly governments in high biodiversity countries that have typically been left out of the big global finance markets, right? They see the huge value in their remaining ecosystems as these biodiversity markets are starting to emerge. The problem we run into is that they have been told that there's a ton of value in the biodiversity in their countries, but it is almost impossible to put a number on something if you don't know it's there. Right, so a lot of the role that we are playing with our government partners is helping them to figure out, first of all, what biodiversity do we think is there, and then to do deeper dives, additional data collection, consolidation of data across NGO or government agency partners to figure out what do we know is there, how rare is it, how threatened is it, what kind of habitat loss or population change trajectories are we seeing? Because those are all factors that go into how valuable could that species or that ecosystem be. And you need that information to put a number on it, otherwise you're kind of guessing. So we play a pretty big role with a lot of governments in helping them to figure out that initial baseline setting of what is there first.
Super. That's great.
Perfect.
Maybe last question.
Yes, I think we're just about out of time.
Quick one, because I'm very glad you bring up the government partners. So my question is that how does Map of Life integrate the global biodiversity data with the local and national monitoring system, especially in places where the data is very fragmented? I come from Vietnam, and I also work on wildlife conservation.
Maybe Claire, you take that one. You've engaged with ASEAN, right?
Yes, so this is a great question. I love this question. That system that I flashed up there very briefly, which we call the National Biodiversity Information System, which is the one we've co-developed with government partners, that question is one of the ones that we had in mind when we developed that tool, right? So we are pulling from these big global databases, but we also know that our government partners have private data that has to stay private for a reason, either sensitive species or regulations in country about data sharing. There are often international NGOs or researchers who have come in from other parts of the world to do research and surveys in those areas. Their data is also in its own database somewhere. So this tool that we have built allows all of these different partners to share the data with these government partners of ours without having to give up the ownership of the data. So we work through the Esri ArcGIS online system so we can have different accounts. People can have the data displayed on this tool without actually having to send it to us at Map of Life or the governments. Same thing, the governments don't have to give us their proprietary data. It allows us to then integrate it, display it on this system so everybody can see, or whoever the government decides should see, can see, what information do we have about which species in which places. We can then tie that into all of these survey recommendations, metrics, things like that. So we're starting to pull in that fragmented data.
And is Vietnam part of the ASEAN?
They are,
So
yep.
maybe talk about that.
Yeah, so we are building kind of a regional level information system for the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. We've been working closely with them over the past year and a half or so to build a system that shows each country in ASEAN and the ASEAN network what metrics, what data do we have for each of those countries at the regional scale, which then allows a deeper dive at the national scale if they have an interest to do so.
Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah. I think we are just about out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you have additional questions, we'll be up here for a little bit longer. Please feel free to come and chat with us. Otherwise, thank you for sticking it out until 5 p.m. We are very grateful and we're glad to have you all here. Thank you.